On a very sober topic, one of the great benefits I find of being in this space and bringing so many experts together is that when things don't go the way that you planned 6 months out, you can adapt very quickly. And we're very fortunate today to have Tom Warwick here. Tom's the director of the Future of DHS project at the Atlantic Council. And I know we've all been following the news. The past 72 hours have been horrific in the Middle East, Tom. Hamas has led an incursion, a violent and abusive attack into Israel. And you're going to go through some of the details here. But I thought it would be fitting for us as a Homeland Security Enterprise Forum to take 30 minutes out of our programming and focus in on a current event right now and someone who's following it very closely, has been deeply involved in that region, both as a government professional and now as a think tanker. So Tom, I'm going to turn it over to you. We're going to make this interactive in just a moment, so please start thinking of some questions. I hope Tom and I are able to spur some of those ideas in the next 30 minutes or so, and the mic runners will be around shortly. So Tom, over to you, sir.
All right. Let me first of all note that I was just checking with the statistics before we came into this session. The proportion of population of the United States to the state of Israel is about 35-1. The death toll is now, in proportional terms, roughly half of what the Vietnam War was to the United States. We're well past references to 9/11, Pearl Harbor, other kinds of things like that. We're into the scale of one of the most significant acts of whether you call it terrorist violence. Certainly, these attacks were carried out in utter disregard of international laws of war. Let's take just a moment of silence to think of the innocent victims, and frankly, the victims there will be on both sides of this. All right, let me start off a discussion on this. My goal is to give you all several things to think about that you may not have thought about already. I mean, this is collectively from people who have been in government, some who are in government, some who will be in government, one of the most important collections of expertise and knowledge on the Homeland Security enterprise. And so what better group to try to collect some wisdom on this, and frankly, just think of things that go beyond what we're likely to be hearing on some of the evening talk shows and op-ed pundits that we're all going to be reading, many of whom will be saying similar things, but there are a host of things that are easy, especially relating to commentary about the Middle East. Let's think about how what we have seen unfold makes us think about aspects of the Homeland Security enterprise. So I'm going to rattle off 5 points for folks to take down and I hope to build upon. Point number 1, and absolutely the most important point, if there is one point that I would request that we all think about and take back to our respective places of work and really do assimilate as we plan for what needs to be done to keep our country and our allies safe. The most important lesson to me out of this is strategic surprise is still possible. We have seen something happen that Israel, for all of its vaunted, justly so, security services, the United States, with our highly developed technical capabilities, did not anticipate coming. I have no doubt there will be commissions of inquiry, there will be finger pointing, there will be commissions, there will be lessons learned. This will be studied for years, just as Pearl Harbor was, just as 9/11 was, just as Sabra and Shatila was, just as the 73 war was, the 67 war. But the striking thing is, even in this day and age, in 2023, strategic surprise is still possible. that ought to be sobering for all of us in the Homeland Security enterprise, because it means that however much we may have thought we have anticipated every possible contingency, we face adversaries, malignant and thinking in some cases, inanimate and benign, as climate change is, as a strategic threat to the security and prosperity of our country. But to be reminded in such a horrific way that strategic surprise is still possible is a very sobering, but I think very important lesson. The second point I want to give you is there is a twisted logic to terrorism. A number of you here in this room, I know, along with me and a few others, many others outside, worked hard to try to understand the logic of Osama bin Laden and Ayman al-Zawahiri and other terrorists, Al-Qaeda, ISIS, indeed Hamas and Hezbollah. What I think is striking is even by the twisted logic of Hamas, the stated idea that they want to rule in the territory that the state of Israel now has, the attack on Saturday makes no strategic sense. If their stated goal is to set up a state that they control, this attack has put that off by a decade or more. And yet they went ahead and did it. Now, it's an open question of why they did that. I'll come back to that in a minute. But it really does highlight the aphorism many of us learned in our international relations courses: when two nations go to war, at least half of them have made a huge mistake. And that is clearly one of the things I think that's driving this strategic dynamic. The third point, which I want us to take away from the second point, because this also highlights our own thinking here in the Homeland Security enterprise, is how many times has tactical success led to strategic failure? I think that's exactly what Hamas has done. In many ways, the success of their brazen attack and their targeting of civilian populations and their kidnapping of hostages makes their strategic failure even more likely. Because all of us remember the expression, I won't dignify the person who made it by recalling his name, that there would be chalk dust on the shoes of CIA officers in the actions they carried out overseas. You ain't seen nothing yet, I'm afraid. Point number 4. For the Homeland Security enterprise, and indeed in a minor way just for this little group, this is one of the archetypal examples of the need for the Homeland Security enterprise to be able to pivot instantly and to deal with threats no matter what their source is and from where they may come. To simply expect the unexpected needs to be part of our DNA. It needs to be part of how we do things. And I know, certainly, the men and women of Homeland Security are working on that at this very hour. But this really is something that the enterprise on a large scale needs to keep in mind. For example, major efforts have already been put in place in the last few hours to protect houses of worship, and frankly, of all faiths, not just synagogues and not even just mosques. But plans are being put in place. My house of worship has a meeting at 7 o'clock virtually for all of us getting together who are on the security committee. I suspect some of you are thinking along similar lines. But we're going to need to now make investments, make decisions, do things to keep our communities safe. And we just need to be able to respond instantly. The fifth point, and this is the closest I'm going to touch on what is the pure Middle East aspect of this, but it's the extreme importance of being able to think 3 and 4 steps ahead in any kind of a crisis. At a think tank, we have the luxury of being able to do that, certainly more than people who have to deal with whatever is just the exigency of the decision that needs to be made in the next 20 minutes. But this kind of strategic insight is hard to develop, but it is essential to develop. And I think as we see, for example, the decision to send a U.S. aircraft carrier battle group into the Eastern Mediterranean. Those of you who know about the history of the last 4 years are certainly aware, this is public, that Hezbollah has significantly increased the accuracy of its rockets and missiles so that Hamas could fire a rocket and hit Jerusalem, Hezbollah could fire a rocket and hit the Knesset. The strategic difference of that is enormous, and I have absolute confidence that President Biden and his advisors are fully aware of the consequences and implications, and are going to do everything they can to deter Hezbollah from getting into this in a more significant way. But if this is to happen, there will be obvious implications for the Homeland Security enterprise, for the need to keep Americans and our allies safe, both here at home and when people travel overseas. That kind of thinking is absolutely essential in a moment like this. So those are some thoughts I just wanted to share with you. There are others. This is the collective wisdom
Yes.
of a body like this. Let me turn it back over to you.
No, thank you, Tom. And Tom is hitting on the idea that let's get some collective wisdom flowing here. If you've got counterpoints to Tom's perspective or other color commentary to add, vetted and verified commentary, please, let's bring that forward. But Tom, first of all, can you talk to us a little more about the reach of Hamas? We recognize Hamas mostly as the Gaza Strip portion of the Palestinian governance and movement. How broadly and internationally do they reach, and is there a known presence here in the States?
Well, I mean, in terms of classified information, we're
not sharing that here.
No, my information would be dated in any case. Hamas has almost entirely focused on its conflict with Israel going back to its founding. When Israel made the decision in 2005 to pull out of Gaza, partly at the urging of the United States, there were elections, and the Bush administration was, in some sense, surprised that Hamas won in Gaza, and then took over Gaza, took over the education system, the health system, the economy, all measures of not just the politics, but the social and economic aspect of that. One of the things that is striking and to some extent counterintuitive is when you listen to Israeli commentators, especially in the last few hours, they have lamented not so much the harsh treatment that Israel has applied to a partial blockade of Gaza. That is to say, Israel controls very carefully, or thought they controlled carefully, what goes from the Israeli side into the Gaza side at the border crossings to Israel. And then the Egyptians control what comes in through Rafah and the south to greater and lesser degrees. But Israeli commentators have noted that there was cynicism in a policy that seemed directed at trying to weaken the authority of the Palestinian Authority, which rules in the West Bank, and to tolerate Hamas, which was exchanging, so people thought until Saturday morning, exchanging relative security for allowing them to have some measure of economic activity. Equally, and even more so now, we're seeing an entirely different cynicism in play because, and this many of us who served in government know, and people need to be reminded about this, is the cynicism of Hamas choosing to locate things like rocket factories, weapons depots, other kinds of military targets in a highly populated civilian environment, essentially allows its own people to serve as human shields, trying to mitigate the force of an Israeli counterattack. Those gloves are going to be dropped.
Sure.
we're now looking at a situation where the operational plan Hamas seems to be working from does seem to be one calculated to produce human suffering among the people of Gaza in an effort, for example, again, you can speculate on this, but in an effort to derail the normalization process between Israel and Saudi Arabia, which is proceeding actually according to its separate strategic dynamic. And so, the cynicism of the plays going on with Hamas is a truly staggering thing.
So is it fair to say your assessment is that Hamas does not have a natural reach here into the United States directly?
Certainly not as much as some other groups. There are any number. I mean, Hamas is a designated foreign terrorist organization. I presume everybody here knows that. So material support to Hamas would be a criminal law violation here in the United States.
Yep.
Now that said, it's an entirely different situation when you talk about the Palestinian people. Many people have friends and relatives, and indeed, what I thought was one of the more interesting and positive developments, there was a positive, not a negative dynamic, I would submit, in the DHS and State Department decision to admit Israel to the visa waiver program at the end of September, because one of the factors driving that was the U.S. insistence that there needed to be full reciprocity so that U.S. passports would allow any American citizen to land at an Israeli airport and travel wherever they wanted without regard to the ethnicity of the American citizen. So that was a positive dynamic.
Sure.
And so that sort of thing, obviously is a source of tension, and I'm expecting we'll see what I hope are purely peaceful protests by Americans exercising their constitutional rights over the next few days. I would hope and expect there will be almost no sympathy for the kinds of terrorist and war crimes that have been committed.
Maybe so. We have heard of protests and counter-protests already occurring in places like New York and others, but those were resolved peacefully ultimately with NYPD and other law enforcement agencies present. So may that continue in the greatest American tradition of speaking out in your First Amendment rights being protected. Who supports Hamas? And again, I will tie it back to our homeland.
Yeah.
What presence might they have here that we should be alert to in the next 10 days or so?
Well, I mean, Hamas's most visible external supporter has been Iran. I know there's a lot of talk, and some of it is speculative, and
Sure.
I suspect there's some that's more informed than others about what Iran's role may have been in this. I must say my own thought on this, if I were a Hamas terrorist leader, the last person I would entrust with anything secret would be to an Iranian official, because of how that would compromise their
But certainly you take
operational
their money, their training.
They do take money. One thing, though, I do think is going to be a consequence of this is I do believe that Israel is going to tighten up considerably any ability that Hamas has to try to get Iranian circuit boards or other kinds of things, and even the kinds of modest level supplies that have been getting in from Iran. Israel is going to try to choke that off. And so then we're in a question where we will see what will be further restricted on that. But certainly, although Iran, formally disavows any knowledge of having, been responsible for this, I don't know any serious counterterrorism official who credits that at all.
Yeah.
But I think more to the point, though, is Iran clearly has an interest in perpetuating the idea of military forces outside of the control of any state. This includes Hezbollah, it includes some of the other terrorist groups they've supported, it includes groups in Bahrain, in Yemen, in Saudi Arabia, in Iraq. And this is their regional strategy.
It's yet another proxy of the
yes.
IRGC.
Yeah, and yeah, the IRGC Quds Force. Let's be very clear about that. And so there's no sign that that is going to change at all in the near future. And it's important for not just our allies, but for the United States to bear that in mind and to make that one of the central points of our strategy.
And I think one of the goals of this conference really was to talk about advancing the enterprise and looking at where Homeland Security has come in 20 years, where we naturally were originally focused, of course, on counterterrorism, preventing the next 9/11, which we've done successfully, to integrating more of domestic national security into the conscience of the American people and into our political puppet masters, if you will. Will this be, do you think, a moment that recalls the purpose of the enterprise and the promise of the Homeland Security enterprise? Not just DHS, but of course, all that was built post 9/11 to keep us safe domestically. Do you think this could be a recall moment for us as a country?
I think it should be, and this goes to my point, Rob, about the appreciation of strategic surprise, because I know as there were many in the government, indeed in administrations of both parties, that were talking about moving away from a focus on counterterrorism and thinking more about great power competition. You know, we had an earlier episode of that same logic in late 2012 and 2013, after bin Laden had been killed, and in May of 2011, there was this thought advocated by some that, well, we can move away from terrorism. And then you had the rise of ISIS, which when it took Mosul in June of 2014 was a shock to many, but not to the CT professionals, who had in fact been warning of something like this. It had been building for several months. It wouldn't surprise me if we were to find, after the lessons start to be learned on this particular experience, that there were similar warnings and they were not taken seriously. And you know, as with the rise of ISIS, as with, many would say, January 6th, as with October 7th, I think we're going to be in a situation where you know, there needs to be a baseline, steady state appreciation for the Homeland Security enterprise.
Sure.
That there are other threats besides terrorism, but we can never forget terrorism. As one of the reasons why we all come together like this.
We can walk and chew bubblegum. Walking is counterterrorism.
We need to be able to do both. We need to
bubblegum is
appropriate funds for both. We need to really, I do think this is a worthwhile moment, especially in the Congress, to take another look at have we scaled the Homeland Security enterprise correctly. In many ways, there was a huge reset after 9/11. There was a smaller reset at a couple of points since then. But really and truly, we have not had Congress ask the hard questions. Are we adequately resourced for counterterrorism, for cybersecurity, for border immigration, trade and travel facilitation, for you know, community programs in resilience response, violence prevention? Are we really actually taking care of our own citizens in this way? And you get different voices who advocate for one or more specific programs within this. It really is, I think, incumbent on Congress to start asking the bigger question: have we properly scaled the Homeland Security enterprise?
Yeah, and that's part of our mission at HSEG is threefold: is to invigorate conversations like this, elevate above partisanship, and integrate solutions. And that partisanship has kept the enterprise from maturing properly, I think. My humble opinion in 20 years or so. Let's go to the audience, please. If there's anyone who wants to add anything to this conversation about Hamas. I got Tom Flofchen there in the front.
Yeah, Tom, thanks for the comments. Just a quick question. So if the strategy or the impetus is to derail the Saudi normalization process, what's the pain point or the threshold that you think might be the actual turning point in that dialogue? And then secondarily, if you don't mind, if it's not that, what is the strategy? What's the motivation at this time?
Our pain point, Israel's pain point, Saudis?
the pain point, I guess, in the global perspective to actually derail the process? So the Saudi pain point.
Well, I mean, I point out that my former Atlantic Council colleague now heads up the engagement office at the State Department, working on expanding the Abraham Accords and the normalization process, Dan Shapiro. We recognized that the strategic logic of normalization of other countries with Israel proceeds for its own reasons and its own dynamics, driven by needs for regional security, and strikingly, and the Saudis have made this very clear, looking to improve the situation between Israel and the Palestinians, but not waiting until that somehow would get solved first before moving on to other solutions. Clearly, this is going to put some things on pause. My view is there will be a point at which the strategic logic of normalization will reassert itself, and that represents, yet another strategic failure on Hamas's part. They can delay it; they can't end it. But I do think that we're headed towards some fundamental changes in the U.S.-Saudi relationship, in the U.S. relationship with the countries in the Gulf. Certainly the fact that the United States does not depend on foreign oil like it did in the 1970s or 80s gives you a chance to really reset the security relationships the United States has with that part of the world. This is why I think the logic of Hamas is so tortured. They have put off the day that they say they want by a decade or more.
Rebecca Diamond, just a moment. Got a mic coming for you. Thank you.
Total civilian here. I've been reading a lot on this. I'm very pro-Israel. Do you think there's any chance that this was a move by Putin to distract the U.S. from supporting Ukraine?
No.
Okay.
No.
Easy enough.
No, Putin would not have gotten a vote on this. The reasons why Hamas chose to do this were specific to them, and as we were saying, they were undoubtedly encouraged, principally by Iran, but this is not something Russia would have been responsible for instigating.
Okay, so my backup question to that is, how did Israel miss this?
I wish I knew the answer to that question. I've got some thoughts, but at this point, apart from some of the more obvious things, we will need to see what finally happened. My guess is, as with Pearl Harbor, as with 9/11, the indicators were all over the place, and I'll throw in January 6th. The indicators were all there, and people simply did not appreciate the idea that their adversaries would do something so incredibly out of scale with what they had done before. And this really is the lesson for us in the Homeland Security to keep in mind. I hope, God forbid, never have another 9/11 or another October 7th in our country where that kind of surprise occurs.
Last question, Gentry Lane.
This is great, by the way. Thanks for this conversation. So 2 aggressors with unprovoked illegal incursions within 1 year. Is this a trend?
Meaning Russia into
Russia?
Ukraine, now
They don't care about
Hamas
Loak.
into Israel.
What do we these guys are like really not playing by the rules.
Well,
We
so
do play by the rules.
Hamas has never played by any rules except their
they
own.
play by their own rules, and everybody in the world has
Right.
declared them a terrorist for that reason. I commend, as I try to do to every class that I ever teach, there's a fantastic book called The Causes of War by the conservative Australian historian Geoffrey Blainey, Geoffrey. Wars occur when 2 countries prefer war to peace. And that's what's happening here. I mean, this was the source of the, in any war, 50% of the countries at least have made a mistake. What you're seeing, though, is victory is a wasting asset. Victory depreciates over time. And so the last time Operation Cast Lead, or indeed the 2006 adventure in Lebanon, Israel got itself, more than, 17 years of peace with its last military operation on this scale. My guess is we will see something that will have a similar effect. 10 to 15 years of relative peace. One hopes there will be good things done during that time. But and the same dynamic takes place in Europe. Putin thought he could get away with it. He thought Ukraine was weak. Hamas thought Israel was divided. Boy, are they wrong.
And Tom, I lied. I'm going to take one more question. Dave Kaplan.
Thank you. My wife was in Israel last month, and she was taken into the West Bank, and what she witnessed was very surprising to her. And when she came back home and told me, I was very surprised as well. Went to a small village, and she saw 100 settlers surrounded and protected by 3,000 IDF soldiers. And when I watched the breach of the southern border in horror a couple days ago, I kept on thinking about that. How Israel's defense forces have been pulled off their jobs to protect very right-wing settlers. And I just would like your insight and your comments on what happened in regard to the border and
That's
how
a
the
very telling
IDF has
point.
taken their eye off the ball.
I was listening to a briefing by some Israeli defense experts a couple of hours ago. People in Israel are struck by the fact that apparently 80% of the Israeli Defense Force brigades were in the West Bank, leaving the much longer border of Gaza relatively undefended, and in particular without the ability for a rapid response that literally thousands of Israelis were calling for using their cell phones and trying to figure out how to communicate from their safe rooms or indeed as horrible things are going on around them. So yes, that will become, I think, one of the key talking points that will be explored and debated over the next few months. But I think, for the moment at least, Israel is not interested in so much retrospection as in trying to figure out how to put an end to what they perceive as a military threat that can only be addressed by military force. And calls for restraint, I think, are going to be something that they may listen to, but we're into chalk dust mode.
All right, I'm going to make this the absolute last one. But I see an HSEC member, and I must call on them, Jean Meserve.
So this obviously was a failure of Israeli intelligence. Was it also a failure of U.S. intelligence? And impact our
In a sense, well, yes. In
ambition?
a sense, yes. As I think a lot of people in this room know, precisely because this is existential for Israel, the United States relies on foreign partners, including Israel, to provide intelligence into strategic actions that Hezbollah or Hamas or some of these other smaller terrorist groups might take. And so, if we had any information, I'm sure it was passed on. It would have been dwarfed by whatever the Israelis were collecting. I mean, their technical, their overhead, their human sources on the ground in Gaza, far exceed anything that we might have had. But I think, and I should say also that the idea that the United States would run unilateral sources in Gaza without the Israelis knowing about it, I find that hard to believe. So I think what we're seeing is, yes, if we had something and didn't pass it on, that should be looked at. But I really do think this is going to be an internal Israeli discussion to which the United States may contribute some small points, but the main points clearly are going to be Israeli.
And hopefully there's some lessons we can take from
Oh, yes.
there
Well,
after
yeah,
action reports
and indeed,
eventually.
yes, I mean, the possibility of strategic surprise ought to be one that
Absolutely.
we take away even as soon as right now.
Completely agree. Tom Warwick, Director of the Future of DHS Project at the Atlantic Council. Thank you, sir, for your time today. Appreciate your thoughts.